Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is 12:30, and so we're going to get started with some of the introductions and a welcome to all of you who are able to join us again for the fifth session for our virtual Feedlot short course. As always, I'd like to thank our sponsors that have helped make this possible, CHS Nutrition, Dakota Land Feeds, and Zoetis Animal Health. We really appreciate their being very willing to help us out with all of the programming that we're doing here at South Dakota State University, in particular for this event. As you've been seeing on this slideshow, it's been scrolling. We've got a couple different ways for you folks to communicate with us. There is the chat button and also the Q&A. I'll be monitoring both of those as we go forward through the program. And when Dr. Smith ends, we'll have an opportunity to, I'll relay those questions to Dr. Smith and get those answered. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Zach Smith as our speaker today. Dr. Smith is our feedlot researcher here at South Dakota State University. It's been here almost exactly 2 years now. And got his undergrad at Texas Tech, his master's here at South Dakota State University, and then his PhD at Texas Tech, working under Dr. Brad Johnson on the topic he's going to be addressing today, growth promoting technologies. Very excited to have had him here for the last couple of years. He's been doing some great things. So with that, I will kill my mic, stop sharing my screen, and turn it over to Dr. Smith.
Well, thanks, Warren, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Should be shared now. Warren, can you give me a yes or no?
Just click the slideshow button. There we go. We're ready.
Cool. All right. Now I need to move this little booger out of the way. Should be able to see my entire slides there. So a while back, Warren visited with me. Warren, can they see my mouse as a clicker?
Yes, I can see it, so I'm going to assume everyone else can, and
cool.
I see Mo's Feedlot just says they can as well. So
good deal. All right, sweet. Well, anyhow, Warren kind of gave me this topic, growth enhancing technologies, growth management technologies, and it's something I've had quite a bit of experience with as a graduate student, and even here in my faculty position at SD State, we've done a little bit of work in regards to the best use of these technologies. Here recently, though, we've been doing a lot of other things, working on integration of crops and livestock, and so this isn't, I tried to update it as much as I could, but it's definitely a broad topic. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to the use of these technologies, and so my recommendation is that you take this information, visit about it with your consulting nutritionist or feed sales representative. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to email me at any time. So today's talk is the best use of growth enhancing technologies. So to start the talk, there's two things we got to think about here. Do we want muscling and feed efficiency? And then one needs to ask if marbling matters. One thing for certain is that as we feed cattle, feed conversion efficiency is going to be the best early on in the finishing phase. If we kill those cattle early, they're going to have really good closeouts in regards to feed conversion efficiency. But if we don't get that overall population of cattle to the right degree of finish in regards to rib fat, or we pull the trigger too early, we might give up things in regards to carcass quality. And so there's a fine line in regards to understanding how to use these technologies so that we don't screw marbling up by using the wrong implant or management practice too early in the feeding period, or too potent, it doesn't match caloric intake. But if we take those cattle out too far to the other end of things, we really give up things in regards to feed conversion and feed cost of gain. So we talk about the animal feeding industry as a whole. Now we're all after fast growth rates, and we want a good conversion of feed into sellable product, and we want to produce a product that has a high muscle to fat ratio. Now our product is different from the other farmed animal species in the fact that we think about product quality, and we think about this to a very high extent relative to the other meat products one can buy at the grocery store. And so at least here in the United States, we're interested in producing choice or greater cattle, upper 2/3 choice preferably. We don't want to have too much subcutaneous fat in regards to rib fat accumulation and carcass waste. And we also want to produce a tender product that the consumer wants to continue to eat and spend a good bit of money on and further support the beef industry. Now, when we think about beef production in the United States, we are one of the countries that uses these growth management technologies in nearly every phase of production. And so when we just think about an overall average of what these technologies can bring to the table, we think about daily gain, whether it's an implant or a beta-adrenergic agonist, we're going to be able to improve average daily gain depending upon the stage of production, intake level, between 10 and 30%. Now, these technologies that we use, implants and beta-agonists, really only moderately affect dry matter intake. And so when we increase gain and don't have really a huge change in regards to dry matter intake, what we end up doing is improving the feed conversion efficiency. Now, implants and beta-agonists don't work in regards to the same mechanism. Steroidal implants, generally, every one of them has an estrogen in it. And then it's an estrogen alone or an estrogen in combination with a progestin and an androgen. And really the way estrogen works is that it increases long bone growth. And so what this allows us to do is we essentially change the frame size whenever we implant an animal, which allows us to achieve a greater body weight with less subcutaneous back fat, and this results in greater carcass weight. I think one really cool thing to think about is Dr. Pritchard, who was formerly associated with South Dakota State here. When he started in 1984 to when he left in 2018, we produced nearly 50% more beef per cow. And so what this means in regards to numbers is in the US, we produce just as much beef today with about 33% less cattle. So we've had a reduction in the cow herd size and the cattle size from 45 million to 30 million, and we still crank out just as much beef. Now I'm going to move into the different growth management technologies. So what are some of the tools available to producers? This is originally from Ron and Preston. It's been updated by Dr. Johnson in the past, and this is my most up-to-date version. The only thing that's not included here is the newest beta agonist that Elanco sells. But we start with oral DES, then DES implant, and then here we have an estrogen progesterone implant. This would be the pioneer product of Synovex S. It's still produced today. We can move into some other technologies. We're not going to talk about melangestral acetate, but this is used to suppress estrus in heifers and can also increase circulating concentrations of estrogen, and the net effect is increased growth. Really, the technology changed in the early 90s when we were the first compound approved of that combination type implant was Revlor S. And then shortly thereafter, there was a Synovex Plus implant that came to market. And then in the early 2000s, we were introduced to beta agonists, namely ractopamine hydrochloride. And shortly thereafter, zilpaterol hydrochloride was introduced, brought to market by Merck. Folks on here might be familiar with zilpaterol hydrochloride. This is a compound that is still approved by the FDA, but it's not marketed and sold in the United States. And then here in the last 13 years, which is what a lot of my dissertation research was focused on, is these new long-acting implants. Now, they're not all created equal. One of the companies has an implant technology that has an initial release implant and then a coated implant in the back half of the pellets that can delay payout of that implant till about 70 or 80 days. This estradiol benzoate TBA implant, these would be the Synovex 1 line, so grass and feedlot. These implants are a little different. They're not an initial and delayed release implant. In 2017, Revlor XH was launched. This is a pioneer product brought to market by Merck. It's an initial and delayed release implant for heifers. And then in 2017, there was also approval, now this product's not sold in the United States yet, of a delayed release implant that's entirely coded to allow implantation and payout 70 days after the implant was placed. And so when we think about the progress we've made, it's really crazy to think about. I remember one day I was hanging out at a friend's house in Lubbock during my PhD, and this boy had a old agricultural yearbook from the 1930s, or maybe a little earlier, and it talked about Hereford cattle coming off of their third winter. And I thought, man, well, things have certainly changed. And then at least back more recently, we can think back to the old shorter, almost dwarf type cattle. You know, they were 3 years old when they got harvest. They had feed conversions of 10 to 1+. And then today is 2020, cattle pushed calf fed into the feedlot, might be grown for a short period of time, 60 to 90 days. And then that animal's put on a top diet, given an implant and other technologies like beta agonist. And that animal is finished at 14 months of age, just a hair after his first birthday. And we routinely see feed conversions of less than 6 to 1. I really like this slide because it talks, it illustrates nicely where we've come from and really where I think we're going in regards to cattle. Now, this isn't entirely the use of these technologies. There's also been a great deal of things that need to be placed in regards to the genetic capability of cattle and feeding management of cattle. But this is just carcass weight of steers from every January, every 10 years, plotted from 1962 to 2018. And the slope of the line right here is about 5. So every year we've increased carcass weight on steers by about 5 pounds. When we take a look from 1962 to 92, so this was only in the era of estrogen or estrogen progesterone implants and no beta agonist, the average increase in carcass weight was about 3.5 pounds. And from 92, so the era of combination trenbolone acetate estrogen implants and the feeding of beta adrenergic agonists, we've increased carcass weight nearly 6.5 pounds per year. Certainly some differences in genetics over the years, but a good deal of this would need to be attributed to the use of these technologies. So this is some data that was shared with me by the Midwest PMS group. These are some closeouts from their customers, and this data was actually published in the Open Journal of Animal Science this year. And it's just talking about all natural versus conventional. So keep in mind here, this is an all natural program. So this is like a never ever 3, no implants, no beta agonist, no antimicrobials. But just within a yard, heifers and steers, we can see a nearly 25% difference in average daily gain and approximately a 6 to 23% difference in feed conversion ratio. And heifers, the typically responses to technology is not nearly as large. And so here we see a 15% increase in average daily gain, really a reduction in intake, but about a 16% difference in dry matter feed conversion ratio. And here's an entirely different yard where these cattle have a difference, more days on feed, they weigh more, but their overall average daily gain is about 13% different. And then here with the heifers, it's only 5% different. Really no differences in intake amongst the yards, but a range from 16 to 23% differences in feed conversion ratio. Now keep in mind, implants delay fattening, they extend the growth curve, so these cattle are fed for longer periods of time, and they generate more weight when they're harvested. Now it's important to remember that there are sex differences, at least with implants, in regards to the observed improvements in feed conversion, in intake. Hirschler and others in 1995 compared steers versus intact heifers. And in that data set, they indicated about a 21% increase in average daily gain for steers relative to non-implanted animals. And with intact heifers, this was approximately 10.5%. Now, Dr. Pritchard and Rust in the Oklahoma State Implant Symposia compared intact versus spayed heifers. And this was 6 studies that was about 1,500 heifers in total. And when they compared non-implanted heifers to intact heifers that were not spayed, they saw about a 10.5% improvement in daily gain. And when you remove the gonads from these heifers, approximately 16% increase in daily gain relative to non-implanted animals. Now, it's also really important to think about the genetic capability of cattle. One common misconception is that cattle that have superior growth genetics, better than average, don't need an implant. And when someone tells you that, they really don't understand the biology and the mechanism in which these implants actually work. So I'll give you an example. If I had an animal that 150-day cattle was going to gain 3 pounds a day, if I give that animal an implant, they're going to gain 3.6 pounds a day. That's about a 20% increase in average daily gain. Now, alternatively, if I had an animal with superior growth genetics that could gain 4 pounds a day without an implant, I would expect that animal to gain about 4.8 pounds per day if implanted. So the old misnomer that there's good enough growth genetics to not need an implant is quite false. To illustrate the genetic differences within the feeder cattle population in the United States, and it's unbelievable. Midwest PMS was kind enough to share with me a snapshot of some cattle that their customers had fed. And this included 2,200 heifer lots and 1,900 steer lots. These animals in this particular example here would have been placed at an average weight of 675 pounds, so 240-day cattle up in this part of the world. And it included animals between 650 and 699 pounds. And at least in heifers, and this was calculated using a standardized feed selling price and a standardized miscellaneous cost for implants and other technologies that were used. Essentially what we have here, this data is published in the OJAS article, Smith, Anderson and Johnson, 2020. We have here a per head value index. This per head value index is essentially the purchase break even of what could have been paid for that animal based upon what they gained, what they ate, what their feed conversion was, and what percentage of death loss. So for these 2 lots of heifers that came in weighing 650, left at 1,200, spent 143 days on feed. This is deads out average daily gain, 134, 1.34, 20 pounds, 19 pounds intake, and they converted at 14.5 to 1, but had nearly 30% death loss. When you purchase those calves, you really could only afford to pay $560 and break even with them. Now, alternatively, there was 3 exceptional lots of heifers that had a per head value of 1150. Now, these heifers came in weighing 680. They left going 1360, spent 200 days on feed, gained 3.5 pounds a day, ate about 17.25 pounds of feed, converted at under 5 to 1, had 0 death loss, and their purchase break-even cost was $11.38. Now, what's really interesting here is the value differential between the worst and best lot of cattle. Just think of these as black-hided heifers you don't know anything about. And there's a value differential of approximately $600 between the poorest doing lot and the best doing lot. So cattle, these aren't unprofitable cattle. You just need to know how much you can pay for them when you buy them. So I think this is a huge opportunity for us to better understand what cattle are worth. Price determination of feeder cattle is one, not a low-hanging fruit, but it's certainly a piece of the fruit tree that we need to have a better understanding of. I could share the same thing with steers. I'm not going to beat it to death, but here we had some steers gaining 4 pounds a day, converting at under 5 to 1, very little death loss. And the range in value here is nearly $650, differential between the poorest doing lot and the best doing lot of cattle. Now, this talk isn't about all natural cattle, but I can't help but explain this. So now, this is not an example for NHTC. Really, fallout risk in NHTC is not that high. You're allowed to use antimicrobials when the cattle are sick, but this here is all natural. And so when you buy the all natural critter, you're going to pay a price premium for that individual, and then you're going to forego the use of technology. And at least if you're in a Never Ever 3 program, if you have to give a sick animal a shot, they're going to fall out. And so here is using differential purchase cost and differential selling cost. This is selling the animal at conventional prices with assuming no fallout. You would net in this simulation about $70 per head. Now, if you were to have 100% retention rate in the program, you could expect returns of upwards of about $110 per head. But you're not going to keep 100% of the cattle in the program. You know, fallout rate in a calf fed and an all natural program might be as high as 20%. And in yearlings, it's going to be 5 to 10%. They're just straightened out cattle. But also got to think about what the outweight's going to be when you salvage the other cattle. And so here, with full value, you would need to keep, anytime you keep, this is the heaviest outweight, this is assuming differences in daily gain. If you were to maintain weight on those cattle, you could have 50% of the cattle fall out of the program and still return just as much as the conventional cattle. Now I want to get into talking about these steroidal implants with anabolic activity. And really, they all contain estrogen, and then they contain either an androgen or a progesterone. And for example, a Zeranol implant or Ralgro is an estrogen-only implant. A Synovex S and a Synovex C is an estrogen progesterone implant. And when we combine these hormones in the implant formulation pellet, keeping the progesterone in the mix allows us to keep those estrogen levels in circulation a little longer. It extends the payout of the implant. So we have natural estradiol 17 beta. There is estrogen analogs like estradiol benzoate. So estradiol benzoate, if you look at a Synovex Plus, for example, so 200 milligrams TBA, 28 milligrams of estradiol, when they attach that benzoate to the estrogen molecule, it increases its molecular weight. And so approximately 73 to 77% of the 28 is 20. So it's essentially the same as a Revlor 200, those two implants. Synthetic was DES, not marketed or used anymore. Naturally occurring testosterone propionate. This is used in heifer formulations, namely the component EH or component or Synovex H. And then synthetic androgen here is Trenbolone acetate. Now the big difference here is that they're both anabolic, but Trenbolone acetate is significantly less androgenic, so it doesn't cause the thickening of the neck and the secondary sexual characteristics that are associated with the natural occurring analog. And then progesterone, this is the pregnancy hormone, is progesterone. Now, steroidal implants, as I'm sure you all know, are applied in the middle third of the year. Now, keep in mind, a calf can receive up to 3 implants during his life. And this ideal placement zone is also where we like to put our ear tags for good retention. It is important that the ears are used. These compounds are used according to label. The ears are removed early in the slaughter harvesting process, and they don't enter the human food supply chain. So off-label and improper use of implants can cause residue issues, which is something we really want to try to avoid. Now, when we think about steroidal hormones, these are quite easily the most common and widely used growth management technology that's used in cattle. There's over 30 commercially available, either pioneer or generic equivalent products in the US, and it's very common for animals to receive a calf hood, a stalker, and sometimes at least one and sometimes two finishing implants. And there is a 0-day withdrawal prior to harvest. So in theory, you could implant cattle the day before they go to the plant. Now that wouldn't be very smart because it would be lost. You wouldn't realize the benefit of that implant, but there is no withdrawal in regards to the use of this technology. Now, typically responses and average daily gain increase throughout the life of cycle of production. Calf hood, stalker, feedlot, we have essentially a linear increase from about 5 up to 20 or 30% in feedlot cattle, and we can improve feed conversion efficiency approximately 10%. One thing to keep in mind here with stalker, we'll start with calf hood implants, is understanding the age of the dam. Now, Pritchard and Taylor published a beef report, I believe it was in 2015, and in that particular study, they were looking at implanting calves at spring branding or waiting till August when cattle were revaccinated. And this study was actually a factorial design, so you had the factor of spring or August implanting, so at branding or revac, and then the age of the dam, cows over, believe it was 4 years of age or under, so old and young dams. And what they found out was that in the older cows, calves out of older mama cows implanted at spring branding had increases in weaning weight over negative controls. Calves that were not out of young cows implanted in the spring, mothers that are immature, not fully developed, those cows weren't producing enough milk to support the anabolic stimulation of the implant. So they also tested if they just waited to implant in August, and those calves out of the young dams actually had increased weaning weight relative to non-implanted animals when you delayed that calf hood implant till August on a spring calving herd. We talked about stalkers, quite variable here. This is in relation to, at least in a grazing scenario, forage availability in a dry lot like we'd be doing here in the Northern Great Plains. Don't have to worry about energy intake. And then in feedlot cattle, somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% improvements in average daily gain. Now, when we think about carcass traits of the finished animal, since we give estrogen and we're extending bone growth and delaying the time point at which that animal gets an appropriate level of finish, we in turn increase carcass weight. We also increase dressing percent, increase the muscularity of the cattle, and there is evidence that implants do lower marbling scores. One common theme within the literature when implants lower marbling scores is when cattle that were implanted are compared to non-implanted animals and they're harvested at an equal days on feed. That's a really big issue. We can mitigate this by extending the feeding period to where the implanted cattle have a similar degree of rib fat, and then oftentimes we get those percent choices back up to where the non-implanted animal would be. Now also, improper use of an implant can destroy marbling too. So if I give a 200 milligram TBA, 20 milligram estrogen implant to a bawling calf, well, just get your checkbook because you're going to pull the marbling right out of them. That's just the wrong stage, wrong potency of implant to use at an improper stage of production and at a time point when energy intake is inadequate to support the anabolic stimulation that's going to come forth from that implant. So we think about just what happens biologically in regards to the use of an implant. This is some work that was published by myself and Dr. Johnson during my dissertation. And we got some 6 weights, fed them for 200 days, no implant. This XR is a extended release 200 TBA, 20 milligram estrogen implant that was approved in the US, and Merck produces it. XS, this is a 200 TBA, 40 estrogen. It's an initial and delayed release implant. And then we implanted cattle either on day 0 or on day 70. And typically when we think about active anabolic stimulation time is when cattle have hormone levels in excess of the negative control. So when I look at these blood values, really anytime an animal has hormones of estrogen above 5 picograms per mil, so this is parts per trillion here, we're going to have hormone payout, as you would say. And so you can see here, here's the non-coded implant on day 1. Here's the XS. The XS is above 5 picograms per mil all the way out till day 200. This 200 implant on day 1 was pretty well paid out by day 140. This XR worked as intended. It didn't do anything till day 70 and maintained above 5 picograms per mil for nearly approximately 130 days. And then this delayed 200 implant would have had hormones above 5 picograms per mil for some time. This is ceratrimbolone 17 beta. So trimbolone acetate is in the implant formulation. It gets deacylated, and then this 17 beta trimbolone is actually the anabolically active compound. And really the payout pattern is quite similar to the estrogen. Insulin-like growth factor 1, this would be produced by the liver, hepatic output of IGF-1. There's differences between implant treatments over time. So this is kind of an illustration of what we're looking for when we use these and comparing them to the negative control. Serum urea nitrogen is an indicator of anabolism or not. A reduction in nitrogen in sera, urea nitrogen in sera, is an indicator of muscle or nitrogen utilization and subsequently anabolism. There's a reduction here on the early 200 implants, and these are different than the negative control depending upon when they were designed to pay out. Now, this was a cartoon that I first saw from Dr. Pritchard when I was a student of his, and his was very similar to this, quite simple. But when we think about a non-implanted and an implanted animal and just days on feed, so implants are down here on the bottom, the non-implanted animals up top. We're going to alter bone growth. So you can see here bone's bigger. Increasing long bone growth allows us to facilitate more muscle and hold more muscle on that skeleton, and also results in a delaying and fattening. One thing to keep in mind is that you can't feed more marbling in cattle past their genetic potential. So here we are at an equal days on feed. The non-implanted animal is a yield grade 3. He weighs about 1,000 pounds. He's got a 650-pound carcass, and he's grading choice. Now, since we delayed fattening, increased muscle and bone growth, increased bone growth caused this delay in back fat accumulation. This implanted animal at the same days on feed is a yield grade 1. He's select, but he's got more carcass weight. Now, if we're to extend that out and feed both of these animals a little bit longer, the non-implanted animal is now a yield grade concern. He's only got a 750-pound carcass, and continuing to feed him didn't make us go from choice to prime quality grade. Now, the implanted animal is a yield grade 3. He's achieved the choice quality grade, and he's got an 850-pound carcass. So this is why a lot of times when killed at equal days on feed, an implanted animal looks to be poorer doing than the negative control. If we just feed that animal to an appropriate level of finish, a good chance they're going to grade choice, and we're going to generate a considerable amount more carcass weight. This was a study that was just recently published in the last month. This is a pooled analysis of about 6 large pen feeding studies. That there was approximately 17,000 heifers enrolled in this study, and we just got it published in TAS This was in collaboration with Merck Animal Health, South Dakota State, and a variety of other cattle feeding entities in the United States. So you can see here no difference in initial body weight, really no difference in overall performance, except for this, there was a difference in intake here, favoring the non-reimplant cattle. So these heifers here were subjected to an IH200 protocol. These heifers here in XH were given a initial and delayed release implant. No difference in performance, no difference in daily gain, but a difference in feed conversion and no difference in animal outcome when we talk about mortality, removals, or out cattle. So we typically like to look at these data here on a deads and removals excluded basis. Here's the differences though in carcass traits. There was a difference in dressing percent favoring the reimplant program. These heifers here received 80 more milligrams of trenbolone acetate and 8 milligrams more of estrogen during this phase of production. There's a 3-pound difference in carcass weight, and it's significantly different. Heifers that were subjected to a reimplant compared to a single coated implant had greater ribeye area, no difference in marbling, a very small difference that was significant in back fat, and a difference in calculated yield grade. There was also a difference in the overall distribution of carcass yield grade. So the way these were analyzed is we can't compare each individual group, but across all these, they differed. So you had a greater amount of 1s in the reimplant group and fewer yield grade 5s. And also carcass quality grade differed. We had an increased abundance of heifers grading prime in the coated implant and fewer heifers grading select. This was another study to kind of show you what can happen. And those heifers were fed on feed here in these 2 slides between 150 and about 200 days. Now here's an example of when you use these coated technologies and don't feed them long enough. So this was a no implant, non-coated implant, or a coated implant. These 2 implants here had the same dose of TBA and estrogen. No differences in incoming body weight, and really no differences in final body weight. This was a very not well replicated study. It was a very intensive muscle biopsy study where we were after other things. So nothing statistically different here, but we did see improvements in gain as we would expect. Those animals given a non-coated implant ate more, had better feed conversion, and had, at least the implanted cattle had a differing caloric content of their live weight gain. And then when we take a look here, just get on down here to the bottom. This is a body weight at equal composition. The animals given a non-coated implant and fed for 140 days compared to a coated implant had greater body weight at a common body fatness endpoint. So really interesting data there. This is a study. This was included in the last set of green slides. It was a study that was published in collaboration with Merck Animal Health, South Dakota State, and Cactus Feeders down in Tulia, Texas. And this was a factorial study. We have implant by days on feed. So 2 different implant programs, a coated initial delayed release implant, or a non-coated non-coated reimplant program. There was about 3,600 heifers enrolled in this study. And so there was 2 implant programs, and then they looked at the effect of increasing days on feed. So they determined that these heifers were going to be finished at 150 days on feed, but they then continued to feed a group of the heifers for another 21 days and an extra 42 days there to harvest them all. There is no interaction, so we just take a look here at the main effects. At least in this particular study, heifers given the XH were not removed from their pens for reimplanting, and they had a tendency to have greater intake and they had greater intake the 10 days following reimplant than the heifers here in IH200 that were removed from their pen. And then there was a difference in feed conversion, no difference in gain, but these heifers ate more, so they had poorer feed conversion efficiency. And then this here illustrates what increasing days on feed does to final body weight. We go from 1265 and feed them an extra 42 days, and we increase them their outweight by about 90 pounds. However, we have a reduction in daily gain. Really no difference in intake, so we can see poorer feed conversion efficiency here. And we actually alter carcass weight, so we don't need to look at carcass adjusted performance. This is the interesting slide. Once again, no implant by day interaction except for yield grades here, and I'm not going to present that simple mean data. It was for yield grade 2s and 3s, but for all these traits here, carcass weight, carcass gain, dress, back, rib fat, ribeye area, marbling, and empty body fatness. There was a difference here for dressing percent favoring the reimplanted heifers. Reimplanted heifers were leaner. They were heavier muscled, no difference in marbling, but a difference in overall empty body fat accumulation. There was a tendency to have greater proportion of prime carcasses in the coated implant heifers, and then fewer yield grade 2s in the coated implant, and overall an alteration in heavy yield grade distribution. And there was also a greater amount of heifers with carcass weights of greater than 1,000 pounds in the IH200. What's really interesting here on this days on feed, as we increase days on feed, 42 days, we're able to increase carcass weight by about about 65 pounds increase in carcass weight. We increase carcass gain, we increase dressing percent, the cattle get fatter, there's a linear increase in marbling, and we get greater quality grades. And we also increase the percentage of cattle grading prime, and a reduction in cattle grading select. But you can also see here that we increase the amount of heavy carcasses. So something really interesting when we think about growth enhancing technologies is the talk of carcass transfer. So the way I explain this is average dressing percent of cattle, say 63%. When an animal arrives at the feedlot, their dressing percent, so just hot carcass weight divided by live weight times 100, might be 52 to 55%. So I always think back to, I never took physics, but I did take pre-cal in high school, and I made a 55 on my first exam. Now, to get to the passing grade of a D, a 63, I had to make some 80s and 90s and some 78s to pull that grade up. And this is essentially what happens as we increase feeding duration for the last 42 days. We have nearly 75% of the animal's gain being gained as carcass weight. So I'll give you a really easy example. If in the last 42 days on feed, if you extend the feeding period an extra 42 days and your cattle are gaining 2 pounds a day, 1.5 pounds of that is carcass gain. And so one way to precision feed cattle is to understand what carcass transfer is, how much of that is being attached to the carcass, and if you're selling them in the beef, you want to take those cattle till their daily feed cost and the cost to keep them there, and then the money they're generating based upon carcass transfer converge. And that's probably the ideal time to sell cattle, assuming you can avoid overly fat cattle in heifers or overly overweight cattle in steers. And then in another group of cattle, carcass transfer was nearly 80%. So this is when you extend the feeding phase an extra 42 days. Now, we always get the question of delaying implant, and I talk about this with some of my colleagues out in the industry all the time. Dr. Pritchard did a great job demonstrating that delaying implants is a great idea. However, it's not always done in practice, because unless we're revaccinating cattle, it's just not commonplace to bring them up 3 to 4 or 5 weeks after they arrive at the yard. So one thing to keep in mind, though, at least with delaying the implant, is when we look at relative gain responses. So here, the black line is the non-implanted cattle scaled to 100. And these are essentially the treatment average daily gains divided by the control, then we get a percentage increase. And so as cattle increase days on feed, the relative gain response to a non-implanted animal becomes greater. And so we think about needing the most anabolic punch later in the feeding phase when cattle are fatter. That's where this whole idea in regards to relative gain response is very important. And so you can see here, 70 days after these cattle were implanted with the 200 TBA 20 estrogen implant, they had a nearly 50% increase in average daily gain over the negative control. The cattle that were implanted early with the same implant never really got over a 20% difference in average daily gain compared to the negative control. And this is a function of their intake level. They just never got intake up high enough, whereas when these cattle were eating a considerably greater amount of intake compared to the negative control and then received the anabolic stimulation, they had a really nice improvement in average daily gain. And Dathan and I, my current grad student, we've demonstrated this again, looking at relative gain responses when we talk about throughout the feeding phase. This was interesting because a choice is half of a plus. And at least for 140 days, about 120 days, we had improvements in gain over the negative control cattle. Same thing here, just a different way to look at this. Scaled at 100, from day 28, 0 to 28, these were this is just scaled at what their gain was relative to the control. Then we see a 40 to 30% improvement, and really these two implants did about the same thing, even though this was half the dose. Now, when it comes to understanding how to best use these technologies in regards to delayed implanting, it's really important to understand postnatal growth curves of muscle, bone, and adipose tissue. This is an illustration from Dr. Owens, and so we could put any unit of growth over here, whether that's mass, length, kilograms, grams, pounds. So from birth to harvest or maturity, we can all relate to this. We're pretty much at our mature height by 8th grade. At some point, muscle plateaus. This is something to do with the biology of skeletal muscle growth and a reduction in satellite cells to support postnatal skeletal muscle hypertrophy. But here, this fat line is going up, and it can go up exponentially forever until fat kills you. If you think about, if you ever watched My 600-Pound Life or the one half-ton man, our ability to accumulate fat is nearly non-stopping. Now, the fat we're talking about here is seam fat and subcutaneous fat. That's not intermuscular fat. Dr. Bruns and Dr. Pritchard demonstrated that IMF accretion is back here in this part of the growth curve. And the way they figured this out was really interesting. So this is a line here of some serial slaughtered calves from about 400 pounds carcass weight up to about 1,000-pound carcass weight approximately. Marbling here grew at a linear rate the entire time. And then this was rib fat accumulation. Rib fat and marbling do not grow at the same rate as animals progress in the feeding curve. There was another group with marbling scores here that Dr. Pritchard and them had where they gave them an implant at the very beginning, and their marbling score got pulled down there. They gave them too much implant too early in the feeding phase when they weren't eating enough. Now, if you delayed that implant to out here, when the cattle are up on feed, they did not pull this marbling line down. I think it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, you can't feed more marbling into cattle, all right? So genetic propensity to marble is huge. You get that whole population to a ½ inch, they're going to grade what they're going to grade. You can't feed from a ½ inch of back fat to 1 inch and change percent choice or percent prime And if you take a look here, this is some older data back from the early 2000s when we were grading about 60% choice on average as an industry at a PYG of 3.25, which is approximately a ½ inch of back fat. We were grading about 65% choice. Now, when we think about delaying the implant, we need to think about whether or not intake is adequate for the increased lean gain potential. This was some data I pulled out of some of Dr. Pritchard's old data files he left here, and this was just the first 56 days on feed. So we could take a look here at this light green line is intake. So we went from 14 pounds of intake at the start to maybe day 21. So we've increased intake here about 33% in the first 21 days. And a lot of times, you know, we'll delay implant, at least in our research yard, 14 to 21 days because we have the labor, the flexibility, we're grabbing weights, we're grabbing different samples. But waiting till intake is up to a considerably greater level than it is on the first day can allow us to protect choice grade. And this data right here that Dr. Pritchard published in a beef report is really where the rewrite on marbling began. He fed some cattle, the same diet. These were some big yearlings. I think it was 120, 130 day cattle. The negative control cattle that didn't get an implant graded 68% choice. He gave some cattle a Synovex Plus on day 1. He gave some cattle a Rev S on day 1. And in another group, he gave a Ralgro initially and then re-implanted with the Rev S on day 56. And what was interesting is that the control and the Ralgro Rev S cattle actually had similar, not statistically different percentage choices. And this kind of went into the face of what everyone thought about marbling, because everyone had been telling you that do not implant them as you get closer to finishing. But this led to a slew of studies and a great bit of information that has essentially reinvigorated the way we understand how marbling develops in beef cattle. And so Pritchard followed this up with a study where he looked at lifetime anabolic exposure and also looked at cattle that were never implanted, given an implant on day 0 of the finishing phase, or cattle that had delayed the implant until day 57. So these cattle were up here on feed prior to getting implanted, and then looked at percentage choice. This here is just retained energy divided by gain, which gets us a caloric content of live weight gain. So the cattle that were given the implant on day 1 had less fat content in their live weight gain. Cattle implanted on day 56 here had lesser fat content in their live weight gain for the ensuing 56-day period. Then at the end of the deal, the last 28 days, these cattle here had similar fat content in their live weight gain. But what was really interesting was when Dr. Pritchard and Dr. Bruns delayed that implant till day 57, they had an equal amount of carcasses grading premium choice, whereas cattle implanted with the Revlor S or the 120 TBA 24 milligram estradiol, the day they got to the day they started the finishing period, had a nearly threefold reduction in the carcasses that were graded as upper 2/3 choice. So things that we know when we implant cattle, whether it's early or delayed, we're going to increase gain, we're going to improve feed conversion efficiency, we're going to increase carcass weight, dressing percent, and longissimus or ribeye area. Now, what happens when we delay the terminal implant? We can increase the percentage of carcasses that are going to grade premium choice or greater. Now get into beta-adrenergic agonists. This is probably, well, without doubt, an area that I have considerable less expertise in. I've been involved with some beta-adrenergic feeding studies, but it's nothing that, you know, it's a technology that I take for granted. I just use it when I need to. Here's a slew of differing beta-adrenergic compounds. As a whole, these compounds are termed phenylethylamines. Ractopamine, zilpaterol, and salbutamol are all approved for use in meat animals. Salbutamol is used in South Africa. This is actually the active ingredient in an albuterol inhaler. Some Adderall was investigated early and made meat really tough, so it got abandoned. And clenbuterol was promising in the early drug development pipeline. However, it has an extremely long half-life due to its really high binding affinity to the beta receptor, and there was really big residue issues. So the American Cyanamide Corporation abandoned approval of this drug in the early 90s. Now the beta agonists are orally active. They mimic endogenous catecholamines. So endogenous just means produced in the body. The endogenous catecholamines that we're talking about here are things like epinephrine. They're fed for the last 20 to 42 days prior to harvest. And then the withdrawal period depends upon the compound. So for example, with ractopamine, there is no withdrawal. You all might have a nutritionist or feed salesperson that suggests a voluntary withdrawal. And this is primarily associated with some residue issues that we saw in regards to cattle being fed the legal amount, but based upon intake, we're eating too much when we talk about how it was included in the diet. And zilpaterol had a mandatory 72-hour withdrawal prior to harvest. Now, these receptors are attached to economically important tissues in the carcass, namely fat and muscle. Within fat, they cause a reduction in lipogenesis, the production of new fat. They increase lipolysis, the breakdown of fat. And then in muscle, they have the overall effect is they reduce muscle protein turnover, increase muscle accretion, and the overall net effect is an increase in skeletal muscle accumulation. I'm not going to get into this because it's not biochem class, but this is essentially the ligand spans the membrane 7 times. There's an extracellular binding domain. That ligand binds, causes this G-alpha stimulatory unit to dissociate from its gamma and beta complex. Long story short, it takes ATP, makes cyclic AMP. This acts on protein kinase A. Protein kinase A, once phosphorylated, then causes this decrease in fat production and increase in fat burn down. Here we increase protein synthesis, decrease protein degradation in muscle, and the net effect is skeletal muscle hypertrophy. Now, these are the beta receptors. So muscle is multinucleated. Muscle is really unique. It's the biggest cell in the body, really. I mean, you take a look at cut a round steak in half, and you can see the individual muscle fiber, which is the cellular unit of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is also multinucleated. So this here is all the same picture, stained with DAPI. DAPI binds to DNA, and the DNA is contained within the nuclei of the muscle fiber. So this is a muscle fiber with a bunch of nuclei around it. These pictures were taken at Dr. Johnson's lab by Geraldine Hergenretter, a good friend of mine. The beta-1 receptors, there's a greater amount of beta-1 receptors in beef cattle than beta-2, and then you can barely see them here, but there's a few beta-3 receptors in skeletal muscle. So these are where the ligands are binding to and causing, at least in skeletal muscle, that increase in protein accumulation. Ractopamine, zilpaterol, salbutamol, 3 I already talked about, and then the one that's not good for business there is clenbuterol. This is some data that was summarized at Texas Tech. Back when these compounds were new to the market, they did a really great deal where they brought in feedlot operators and meat processors, fed some steers at the university feedlot there at the Burnett Center, and then they actually brought those cattle into the university meat lab. They cut them up, they weighed the head, the tongue, the cheek meat, did all the cutouts of the carcasses to kind of provide a visual representation as to what these technologies are doing in cattle. Zilmax with 20 days of feeding, 3-day withdrawal, and Optiflex essentially have the same live steer weight responses. So if you're selling cattle in the beef, when we had Zilmax, when you're selling cattle on a live basis when Zilmax was still available, there was really no difference. Now, when you were to sell cattle on a carcass weight basis, the zilpaterol had a more pronounced effect on dressing percent and resulted in an increase in carcass weight. It's quite common nowadays with Optiflex. We feed 300 up to 400 milligrams per head per day for 28 to 30 days prior to harvest. Zilmax really has an influence on these stress yield responses compared to ractopamine hydrochloride, and a real pronounced effect on loin muscle area. So nearly a 1-inch increase when Zilpaterol is fed compared to Optiflex at not the highest dose, but a very commonly used dose. And then we could talk about whether or not these are additive or synergistic, and really this technology as a whole is additive in the way that they work. So we can talk about, you don't feed them long enough, you're going to give up some marbling. If you feed them too long, you're going to give up feed efficiency, not good, alters cost of gain. Using technology, you can mitigate this reduction in efficiency late in the feeding phase by appropriate and timely application of implants, use of beta-adrenergic agonists. Now, these technologies can alter marbling, but when used at the appropriate time and the right stage of production, there's really not a huge reduction in marbling, enough to offset the improvements in feed conversion. Now, when we start talking about marbling and choice to select spread becoming quite wide, that's when you really want to have serious conversations about what the best use of these are. With a small spread, a lot of people just think more is better, and that's not always the case. So when we wrap this up, growth management technologies are really important tools to beef cattle producers in the United States. It allows us to efficiently produce meat with less feed, water, and land, and it allows beef to be an interspecies competition with other protein sources, namely pork and poultry. So these are critical tools to U.S. beef production, and we're very lucky to have them. And with that, I would be certainly glad to entertain any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. We've got a couple questions so far, so I'll take these in order. The first one was pretty early in your presentation, where you were looking at the Midwest PMS data set, comparing the natural and conventional heifers. And the question was, were the heifers in that comparison and the natural basically, could they use MGA on the natural heifers?
No, MGA is not allowed in natural heifers.
So that would be another portion of what some of those differential responses might have been, and may have influenced some of the mortality differences if there was a great deal of bulling activity going on in those heifer pens.
Oh, for sure. And so then that comes down to, is there a management technique to mitigate that? I'd say smaller pens and fewer heifers in a pen to help mitigate those issues. You can't spay them because you can't give them antimicrobials.
Good point. We'll switch over to the Q&A. First question, so would the response over the control be the same for a castrated animal or steer compared with an intact male? This particular individual is making the...
I know, Cesar. How's it going, buddy?
Okay, you're reading them. It's all right.
Yeah, I got them right here. Good to see you, Cesar. Hope everything's going great in Brazil. So would the response over the control be the same for a castrated animal compared with an intact male when we implant those animals? I know that in Mexico and South Africa, they have this kind of situation. So yes, you're right, Cesar. At least in Mexico and in Brazil, in South Africa, they do implant intact animals. And typically the responses are actually, they're probably not the same as steers. I just read this the other day, and off the top of my head, it's coming short from me. I still think that a bull implanted has a greater gain response than the intact heifer, not so much as the steer. But what we're talking about here, at least as an absolute value, is a greater response curve. That bull's going to gain more. So when you give the implant, it looks like they gain more. But I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I would say more so than a heifer, but not more so than the castrated animal. I see another question here about estradiol benzoate increases molecular weight. What does this do for the implant? So my take here is that that benzane is going to get knocked off pretty quickly when we talk about steroid hormone metabolism. So there's perhaps a potential that this will increase concentration of the hormone in circulation and allow it to get to its target tissue. But for all intents and purposes, that's probably it. When I think of the estradiol benzoate implant, and there's actually never been a direct comparison of those two pioneer products, the Synovex and Revlor implant, to compare the two. But my guess is it just increases circulation of the hormone. Do you recommend all calves not intended to be sold all natural be implanted at branding? I would, it's a little confusing. I don't think that branding implants are good for calves out of young dams. That mama cow is just not producing enough milk to keep up with the hormone payout, and you might spend the $1.50 on the calfhood technology but not acquire any weaning weight because that calf wasn't getting enough groceries to support the growth. Do I think that there's a misconception that folks think not implanting their animals will get them a premium when they sell the calves at weaning? Yes, and it's quite sad because these folks give up the weight gain. All right, so calves, depending upon the age of the dam, do it at branding in the spring or at revac in the fall. Now, there is this huge problem where folks think that if you just don't implant your calf, you're going to get a premium for them. Well, that's just not true because you don't have the right paperwork in line. You haven't been audited. You haven't been checked out. You're not going to get that NHTC premium. In fact, there was a recently published study by Dr. Ken Odie here in the last year or so, and across all the video auctions, implanted cattle achieved a greater premium than non-implanted cattle. Now, this wasn't within NHTC programs. It was just implanted or not. And the whole idea was is that if somebody restrained a calf to get them an implant, they probably got a vaccine for respiratory and 7-way. So there was a perceived, perhaps the way I understood it, is that folks perceived that those calves had been managed better during the pre-weaning, if that makes sense. Good to hear, Cesar. Warren, you got any more questions?
We're going to go really quickly because we are running right up to a little past 1 hour.
Sorry.
So, no, don't be. But we do, though, have an opportunity in 2 weeks. Dr. Smith will be back on for the final session where this will really be kind of a free-for-all. Dr. Smith, myself, Dr. DiConstanzo, Dr. Dearson, and I'm working on one more so that if you've got some additional questions, that will be the time. In the interest of time, I had a couple, but I'm going to save those for a couple weeks. I see one more. Whoop, got one more. Last one in, Zach.
Yeah, this is okay, so I see it's from, on young calves, what are your thoughts on 3 to 4 week calves getting anything above a C? Yeah, I just had this question come through to me. Only eating 11 pounds of dry matter of a 52 meg TMR. Are we setting calves up for acidosis if they're on a 58? Are we okay giving an IH? So I assume these are all heifers. The IH implant would be off-label use in steers. You know, we typically, I suggest a Synovex C for calves that weight or a Ralgro. I'll give my steers here, they'll be on a 50 meg NEG diet, balling calves, never seen a feed bunk in their life, never drank out of a water trough at the feedlot. And our protocol here on those types of calves is we give them about 14 days. We'll bring them up and re-implant them. This is balling calves. Sometimes we'll wait 28 days when we revaccinate them, but we'll get that implant into their ear, like a Synovex C, so a 200 progesterone 20 EB implant. We'll let that one cook in there, roll for about 70, 90 days, and then we'll give those calves their terminal implant, 200 or TBA 20 estrogen or 120 TBA 24 estrogen. But Brian, I would say a Synovex C is what I'd use. An IH, I would wait till they're at least on a 58. Now, can you get a calf that weight to eat at 58? Certainly. You're gonna have to train them to eat that. I still think there's enough roughage in a 58 that they just don't go crazy, but you're gonna want to be careful getting them up there. Any other questions? Y'all can email me questions too if you want. My email is just zachary.smith at sdstate.edu.
And I'm just typing that into the chat box.
Cool.
So if we can quick grab that. Unless there are any other questions, I think we will close that for this week. Thank all of you again for attending. I'll be sending out an email with soliciting questions for our final session on the 27th. So be watching from that. With that, I hope everyone has a great rest of the week, and we'll see you all next week for Dr. Daly's presentation on cattle health in the feedlot. Thanks again. Have a great week, folks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.